Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf men. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of the engagement of Sarah's daughter Esty Browner to Tina Lam's nephew Jason asked. May we have many more Hadran family smachot. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with, we're in the middle of the story of Mari bar Isak, and soon we're going to see how it connects to our topic. Just to remind you, our topic was, in case you can't remember, I'm sure you do though, if there's people taken into captivity and somebody takes over their land, right? Who's allowed to take over the land? We generally want a relative to. Then we say the relative gets percentages of their investment when the person comes back, right? The person who invested gets to get a certain percentage, and that's an incentive to basically make sure that they deal with the land properly. Then we said, though, there's an exception, and these are just things you're going to need to know for today's daf, which is there's an exception when, mute everybody. There's an exception to the rule, which is when there's a minor who's taken into captivity, we don't allow the relative because the relative can take advantage and then claim that the land was their own. This is going to be a little foreshadowing for what happened with Mari bar Isak. So Mari bar Isak, if you remember, he had property of his father's. His father moved away to a faraway place, ended up having a son. Right? Maybe he had the son before, maybe he didn't. It's not clear whether Mari bar Isak knew of the existence of this brother or didn't know of the existence of the brother, but the guy comes and claims that he's a brother and he gets 50% of the land. So now Mari bar Isak says, what are you talking about? You're not my brother. So Rav Chisda has to deal with this. Rav Chisda says, okay, says to the brother, bring witnesses. The brother says, I can't bring witnesses because Mari bar Isak is this big, tough guy. Nobody wants to testify against him because he'll beat them up or send people to beat them up. We don't know exactly, but he's a scary guy. So he turns to Mari bar Isak and says, so you bring witnesses. And Mari bar Isak says, what are you talking about? You're trying to take land out of me. The burden of proof is on you. To which Rav Chisda says, well, not when it comes to people like you. When it comes to people like you, we have no choice. Then Mari bar Isak says, well, you want me to bring proof, but you don't trust me. You think people are going to lie for me and not testify that this guy's my brother because I'll beat them up. Well, people will then lie for me. How could you even accept testimony I'm going to bring forward? Because you'll just claim, oh, they just lied to say that because you're a bully and, you force them to do that. To which Rav Chisda says, no, I don't worry about that. The fact that they won't testify is one thing, but to actually to withhold testimony is not the same as testifying falsely. So we're left with, he basically says to Mari bar Isak, prove he's not your brother, which you mentioned. That's a little hard to do. It's almost like he's creating an impossible situation. But anyway, the story unfolds in a bit of a different way, which is even though the brother said there's no way I could get anyone to testify for me, well, in the end, he does. And in fact, atu sadeh, I'm now starting in my Gemara, it's 6 lines from the bottom, atu sadeh v'lo masadeh. So we're at the bottom of yesterday's daf. In the end, witnesses came and they testified. Okay? And I'm sorry, that was the wrong line. Lissof, sorry, I read the part about what Mari bar Isak was saying. Skip one more line. Lissof atu sadeh de'achuahu. In the end, the brother brings witnesses that say he's actually the brother. So now he has fair and square rights to the land. So, okay, obviously they split it 50-50. Okay, but the story's not over there. Because Amarle, Liflug, so this brother's real, he's got a lot of claims here. He says, Liflug linami b'pardesau b'sinai d'shata. I also want from the profits that Mari bar Isak invested in my father's land from the time he died. In other words, I get profits, the profits also. Amarle, Shapir Kamarlach, he says to Mari bar Isak, the guy's right. He does get the profits. Now, besides just getting the land itself, he also gets all the things that you invested in. Why? Based on a Mishna Bava Batra. It's not. Right, we're going to get in Bava Batra, our next Masechet, to all sorts of inheritance laws. Father leaves over sons who are minors and big, grown up. And the older ones invest in the property. It's split 50-50. Right? And Rabba agrees that whether this is Rabba or whether this is Rav, Rashi has a whole Gersa problem here. We're not going to get into that, but basically the point is perhaps either it's the way Rabba understands the Mishnah, or perhaps it's just either which way, we're basically saying the kids get 50% of the profits, the minors. So this brother should get 50% of the profits. It's like that case. So Abaye, we're going to have 2 questions on this. Abaye's question doesn't get answered, and possibly Rav Chisda never even heard Abaye's question. But I'm going to Abaye. It's not clear whether he said it to Rabba or he said it it's unclear exactly the way things go here, but he says, midame, it's a totally different case in Bava Batra. Because hatam gdolim gabek tanim yade bekamachle. Why does it work that when the older brothers invest, the younger kids get the investment also of the older brothers? It's because the older sons knew about the younger sons and they did it anyway, right? In other words, what happened? They invested in the entire estate of the father, even though, right, theoretically, they could have just invested in their part. But they invested in the whole thing. That shows that they didn't care, that they were willing to give up. They weren't going to demand it from the kids, from the younger siblings later. But hacha, that's not the case here. Hacha miyada delecha. Rabbi Isaac didn't even know. Okay, it's not clear what he didn't know. Either he didn't know of the existence of this brother, or he just thought this brother will never show up and doesn't even know of my father's properties, and he'll never bother me for this. But either which way, there's no mechila here. There's a concept we're going to talk about a few times today, which is this concept that can we assume by a certain action that a person gave up on their rights to something? So he didn't even know to be mochel, right? He didn't even know his brother was there. So he certainly didn't invest with the intent that, I'm going to give the profits to my brother. In other words, that whole Mishna there is premised on, the Mishna in Bava Batra is premised on mechila. The older ones invested for the sake of the younger ones, and weren't going to demand the anything back. But that's not what happened here. So there's no mechila, so basically no. So he disagrees on that part. But in any case, for some reason, Rav Chisda doesn't respond to this. Maybe Rav Chisda never heard this. Either which way, Galgal Milto Mate the Kamed Rabbi Ami. Well, the story was going around, and it got in front of Rabbi Ami. Amar Lahu, he said, Gedolami zo amru, Shamin lahen ka'aris. Hashtadide lo yahafinan le. He says, wait a minute. We have a problem with this case from what we learned. What did we learn? If you go into your relative's property when they're taken into captivity and you work the land, when they come back, you get profits of, right? The profits, you get the percentage, like an aris. So basically, hashtadide, in other words, there you were dealing with someone else's property, and you still get a percentage of the profits. So here, when Mari Bar Isak was dealing with his own field, again, it turns out it wasn't fully his own field, but at least 50% of it was his, and he thought the whole thing was his. Of course, he should get profits, like an aris at least. So basically, instead of giving 50% of the profits to, the way the land was split, right? 50% to Mari Bar Isak, 50% to the brother, and then the brother also got the profits of the field that he got. So instead of getting the profits fully, he should at least have to give Mari Bar Isak a percentage, like a sharecropper. So they bring back Rabbi Ami's response to Rav Chisda and say, Rav Chisda, how did you give him 100% of the profits on his 50%? To which he says, Amar lahu midami. Those are different cases. When you deal with someone else's property who's your relative, hatam b'reshut nachit, you were allowed to go to that property. You have permission to. Hacha la b'reshut nachit. Mari Bar Isak actually didn't have permission to work that land. It wasn't his, right? It was his brother's land. He wasn't allowed to work his brother's land, number one. Ve'od, and all the more so, if you think maybe, I don't know, maybe for some reason he did, because the brother wasn't here. Well, katanhu, ve'emo redeem karov l'nichsei katan. And here's really the actualization of what we were worried about in the previous staff, what Rav Huna was all concerned about. Because what did Mari Bar Isak do? He went into property that was his minor brother's property and then claimed it as his own, right? And who was going to, right? Who was hoping the brother would never notice. You're not allowed to do that exactly for this reason. So he basically had no permission to be there in the first place. So he certainly isn't going to get, the fact that he invested, that's his problem. Okay, he's not going to get percentages. That's what Rav Chisda says. Ahadrua, the Kamei Rabbi Ami. So they brought it back now to Rabbi Ami. Amar lahu. He said to them, Lo simua kamei de katanhu. Oh, you didn't tell me that the brother was a katan at the time. Had you told me the brother was a katan at the time, I would have known. I would have agreed with you. I wouldn't have started arguing with you. So this is a good lesson in when you tell, when you go to tell someone a story, what happened, you have to give them all the details, because if they don't have all the details in front of them, how are they supposed to know how to paskin, right? So you go to a question to a Rav, or you go to a court and you want them to rule. So you have to give them all the details. He said, I didn't know that. You lo simo kamei means you didn't finish the story. You didn't tell me all the details. Yeah, you're right, Rav Chisda. So in the end, he gives in to Rav Chisda. Then Bar Isak really had no right to be in the land. Because he had no right to be in the land, he has no right to claim the profits of his investment. So it's not the same in the end as, well, in the end, we do learn, right? We tried to compare it in terms of, it's interesting, we tried to compare it in terms of the aris. They should get at least a percentage of the profits. And in the end, we say, no, it's more compared to the part where the child, the brother was a katan, and therefore he had no rights to be there at all, therefore gets no profits. But from here, we move on to another topic. It's going to take us through most of the daf, which is when I watch something of yours. We're in Perek HaMafki, which is all about watching items. We kind of got sidetracked. But if I'm watching your produce, there's an assumption, and we'll see in the Mishna, they're talking about that mice are going to eat. They love mice in the Gemara, right? There's always mice rolling about, taking cakes to different places and other things. Mice are going to eat some of it. So if you give me produce to watch, I actually don't have to return to you the full amount that you gave me. I can deduct. And then we're going to talk about what about in a sale, what kind of deductions can be made. We're going to talk about all sorts of deductions. So you give me produce. So I can deduct a certain amount. How much? Well, it depends on, we make an assessment, how much of certain grains, legumes, okay, we're going to have different categories for different things, different percentages. Lechitim ula ores, when it comes to wheat or rice, there's a big debate here. Rashi says rice here doesn't really mean rice. Rice means millet, okay? And then there's a word, dochad is usually millet. That means something else. Other people say, no, rice means rice, and docha means millet. And okay, debate here. It's not so critical. I'm going to move on from it. But lechitim ula ores, for wheat and rice, Tisha chatzei kabin lekor, 9.5 kav for every core. These are measurements of volume. This is a ratio of 1 in 40. Okay, so 1/40th I can not return to you. The Gemara is going to say exactly what case we're talking about here, because if you gave me a box of, a crate full of grain, what I don't return to you as is. So we'll get to that. L'seorim ulidochan, for barley and millet, tisha kabin lekor, 9 kav for a core, which is a ratio of, right, that was 9 half kavs, okay, which is 4.5. It's a weird way to say it. This is 9 kav for a core, which is 1/20th. Lekosmin ulizera pishtan, okay, for kosmin, spelt, and flax seeds, 3 se'in lekor, okay, 3 se'ah for a core, which is a ratio of 1/10. Okay, so there we assume they eat a lot more of it. Hakol lefi amida, hakol lefi azman. It all goes by the weight, how much, or by the measurement, by the volume. The more volume, the more you're going to deduct. In other words, once I gave it a ratio, right, a fraction, it doesn't really matter, right? It's all the same. But if it's 3 se'im for 1 core, it's 6 se'im for 2 core, etc. And it all depends on how long. This is an amount that's based on a year. We assume that in a year, this is how much it's going to be depleted. So that's how much you can take off when you return it. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What does the achbar care if it's 1 core, 2 core, 3 core? They eat the same amount, right? The mouse eats X amount of food. So if the mouse is going to eat 3 se'ah, then, and we assume, right, in a year, it's going to eat 3 se'ah, whether there was a core, or whether there were 2 core, whether there were 3 core, or 4 core. It doesn't make a difference. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri thinks it's not dependent. It's not a ratio of this to, right, 1/40th, 1/10. No, it's how much we assess in a year a mouse will eat of grain, of, right, of this item. In other words, it's 3 se'ah for a year. It doesn't matter whether it's a core, whether it's more than a core, whether it's less than a core. That's not a factor. We're going to see later, like, what the argument between them really is, what the rabbis will say to retort to that. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda has another opinion, which is if it was a lot, like way more than a core, well, they actually expand at a certain point. Now, they all expand, but, okay, we're going to see the Gemara is going to have a bit of a different explanation, or a bit modify this, but the idea is that these grains expand over time. Now, if you have a core, and you assume the mice eat 3 se'ah, then we're going to say the amount that they expanded, the core expands, is not going to cover the loss of the 3 se'ah. So you're still going to remove 3 se'ah. But once you get into large amounts, you have a really large amount, the amount of expansion is actually going to be equal or around equal to the amount of the mice you're going to eat. So at that point, it's going to be the same, and therefore you don't take anything off. That's his opinion. So now we're going to start with the Gemara. Orez, tuva chaser. But what are you talking about? Why is orez in the first category, 1 in 40? I might see a lot of it. Rabbi Yochanan, but orez kaluf shanu. Okay, the beginning's going to be a lot of reality of their times and what we assume mice eat. So we're going to distinguish between peeled rice and not peeled rice. The mice eat more of unpeeled rice than they do of peeled rice. And we're going to see it's actually going to go into the category of a tenth when you're talking about the peeled rice, with the unpeeled rice. The peeled rice is 1 in 40. The unpeeled rice is going to be 1 in 10. The kosmino lezera pishtan shalosh say in the core, that was the spelt, and this is the smallest, right, the largest amount, which is the 1/10. And the flat seeds are 3 say in the core. Am Rabbi Yochanan, am Rabbi Chia, zera pishtan begivolim shanu. That's when it's still on its stem. Then they eat a lot of it. Tanya namihachi, and here's a braita to support both things we just said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. But here's a braita. This is not the same Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in the Mishna. That's a Tana. Here we're talking Rabbi Yochanan the Amora from Israel. Tanya namihachi, braita to support the kosmin ulezera pishtan begiv olin ulaoresh she'eno kaluf. Here they get really specific. The flax that's that's on the stem, the orez that's unpeeled, shloshasi in the core. That's the 1/10 measurement. That just proved it. Hakol lefi amida. Tana. Okay, braita says, kain lechol kor v'kol v'chein lechol shana v'shana. Okay, that's just explaining what we already know, which is for each core, 3 seihim, or for each core, depending on what number, and for each year. Okay, this goes by the year. That's what I already told you. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So now we're going to see what the rabbis said to him. Amru lo Rabbi Yochanan, harbe ovdot mehen, harbe mitpazrot mehen. Okay, there's a lot that gets lost. Okay, you ever go to one of those stores where they sell nuts and grains and all that, right? They're always falling on the floor, and they're right. And then once they go on the floor, you throw them out. Especially in those days, the floors was dirt, right? So there's just loss involved, even if it's not mice, it's other things. Okay, they're going to fall, they're going to scatter around your house, and then they're going to be gone. So there's other things that cause it to get lost, and others add, which I saw someone wrote in the chat, which is totally what I saw in the commentaries say, which is that mice, if there's a lot, the mice will call their friends and bring more mice to eat, okay? And there'll be a whole celebration there, and they will eat more. So basically, that's their comment to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Tan. Now here comes the big thing, and this is from a Tosefta actually, that this whole Mishna is not when you gave me a box of grains and I left the box of grains on the side, okay? This is talking about I mixed your grains with my grains. You gave me 2 pounds of wheat. I put it with my 2 pounds of wheat. But if I stuck a corner and I said, I'm putting your stuff in this corner, you take it back as is. If 20% got lost, 20% got lost. If 5% got lost, 5%. If 1%, 1%. If nothing got lost, you get the whole thing back. That's obvious. To which they say, the braita continues, the Gemara asks, I don't get it. If it's mixed with my grains, I mixed it. First of all, it's the whole question, can you even mix it? Like, what are you doing? Aren't I supposed to watch your stuff? Aren't I supposed to put it on the side? So some people say I actually could mix it with my grains. Some people say I can't, but what if I did? Okay, and we're talking about a case where I did something wrong, but if I did, I actually can deduct because of this, because we assume there was depreciation or stuff was eaten, etc. So now they say, okay, I put my 2 pounds with your 2 pounds. Okay, so you gave me stuff to watch. I mixed it with mine. Why don't we just look? Okay, so there were 4 pounds. Now there's 3.8 pounds. So take off 0.1 for you, 0.1 for me, and done with it. So they say, but stop it, ma'am. No, it means I put your 2 pounds with my 2 pounds, and I started using them. Okay, obviously, didn't use all of them. I left at least 2 pounds, but I use them. So they say, so what if you use them? Looks like Kama Estepak. Why don't we just check out, right? I measured how much I used. And then we know, okay, so I took out, 50%. Now we're left, you could calculate. Well, Delo Yade Kama Estepak. It's a case where I wasn't careful and I didn't measure. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now we're going to move to this Rabbi Yehuda opinion, this Midah Meruba. So Kama Midah Meruba. What does it mean, a large amount? What point is it a large amount? And in fact, we have a Tanya Namihachi, so 10 core. Already at 10 core, we assume the expansion is going to override the loss. Tanya Mihahi, there's also braita to support Kama Midam Meruba Asara Korin. So braita to support Rabbi Yochanan again, just like we had before. But here we're going to have a braita, Tana Kamedu Rav Nachman, which isn't going to make a lot of sense. A guy brings a braita in front of Rav Nachman, and then Rav Nachman says this doesn't really make sense, and then Rav Nachman's going to explain the braita in a different way. When do we say this? If you use the same measuring implement, we're now going to learn that in the Goren, on the threshing floor, there were certain measuring implements, and there were different measuring implements in people's houses. And the ones in people's houses were more exacting, and the ones in the Goren were more rough, like maybe bigger measuring things, and people would top them off a little bit. So if you did mitoch hagoren and ichzir lo mitoch hagoren, then you would take out chesronot because it's possible you would have some extra. But madal lo mitoch gorno v'chzir lo mitoch beito eno yotzi lo chesronot mipnei shemotirot. But if you measured it in the Goren and then you measured it in your house using those other ones, we assume that you're measuring in the house actually measured already less. So because of that, you don't take out any because you already have less. Okay? So he says, Amrle, what are we talking about? People who have no brains? I said, I don't get it. Why would you ever do that? What, you're going to use bigger implements when you measure it, when you bring it, and then you're going to get it back using the smaller implements? Why would anyone ever do that? That would be idiotic. So Dilma, he says that braita makes no sense. Why I didn't spend too much time trying to explain it. Dilma be a motagoren kamar. What he meant is not madalo mitoch hagoren, meaning with the measuring implements in the threshing floor. What he meant is in the season of the threshing, right? Because there's the season of the threshing, and then there's later when it's stored. So in the threshing season, which happens at the end of the summer, then we're going to say, if you brought me in that season and you returned to me in that season, so there was no expansion to the grains because it was in the summer. In the summer, they don't expand. But if you took it in the summer and then you returned it in the winter, already in the winter season, because of the moisture and all the rain, the grains expand. And because they expand, you're now returning more, right? So even if the mice eat some, they're now bigger. So because they're bigger, people are getting more, okay? And therefore, that's why. So I'm really Rav Papa Abaye. I don't get it. If you're assuming that they expand in this winter, lift kakada, then all the kadim, when you put them in a jug, right? I mean, imagine you fill the jug up to the top and then they expand. The jug is going to explode. Why don't we see jugs exploding all the time? To which we have two possible answers. Either hava uvda upakakada. What do you mean? We've seen this before. Or ibayit ema mishum itzitza. Some people say because it's in the jar. So the jar is very tight. They're all packed very tightly. So they can't expand. But if it's not in a jar, then it actually could explode. Okay, then they could expand. Okay, so that's why the jugs don't generally explode because they're packed. But in the winter, they do generally expand, and it's just not the ones that are in jugs. Okay, that was a side point. Now we're going to move on to wine and oil. And particularly, we're going to spend a lot of time on oil and the sediment of the oil. Okay, you know, we always buy extra virgin olive oil or something like that, right? That's got no sediment in it, basically. We don't really think about sediment so much in oil because you don't usually see the sediment in oil. But there's sediment just like there is in wine. Though in wine, we're really not going to talk about sediment. In wine, we're going to talk about something else, which is when you have wine in a barrel, so the wine gets absorbed into the barrel. And because of that, when you take someone's wine and you put it into your barrel, some of it's going to get absorbed in the barrel. So same thing, when you return the wine, you're going to return less. So now we have a debate in the Mishnah, how much less? Yotzilo shtut liyayin, a sixth you lose. That's a lot. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, chomesh, he says even more, a fifth. So you basically return a fifth less of wine if someone gives you wine. Yotzilo shlosha lugin shemen lemea, 3 log of shemen for every 100 log. Log v'mechze shmarim, log v'mechze bela. So what does this mean? You give back 1/3, 1.5 less log out of 100, Okay, so 1.5% of the sediment. Okay, you can deduct the sediment and you can deduct the bela, what gets absorbed into the barrel or whatever it's in. So that means if he gave you clear oil where there was no sediment, then obviously you're not going to deduct the sediment, right? So if someone gives you oil with sediment, when you return it, you can return it clear and keep the sediment for yourself, okay, without the sediment. And the log v'metzia for the bela. But if it was shomer mizukak that they gave you already pure oil, eino yotzi lo shmarim. So then you don't take out the shmarim. So now, im hayu kankanim yeshanim, eino yotzi la bela. And if you were using old barrels, old jugs, then also there's no absorption. Why is there no absorption? Because it's already absorbed oil. Okay, so I see with your question in the chat, you could return it with everything, but you could if you want, and the guy would have no way to complain to you if you return less, and say, oh, well, that's the sediment. Okay, so it's not like you have to, it just means you can deduct. Now they say Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So in other words, we're basically saying we can, there could be a case where there's no deduction for, it's not like we always say, just take off 3 load. It depends on the situation. If nothing's going to be absorbed into the jug, because it's already full of oil from other times, old, and then there's no absorption, then you don't take that off. And if there's no sediment, because they gave you clear olive oil, then, or whatever oil, then there's no issue there. You can't take that off. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he adds this extra thing, which is going to create a whole question of what his machloka with the rabbis is, like what's the basis? If I sell you, I say I'm going to give you pure oil for the year. You pay me up front, and I'm going to give you every month a jug of oil. I can deduct. You pay me for 100 log. I can deduct the sediment because I promised to give you the full amount, but okay, we're going to see even later, I'll already kind of preface it, but see later, I can claim, at least one of the explanations, I can claim that, well, when I buy it, it has sediment. So I'm going to just deduct the sediment and I'm going to give you less. Now I'll give it to you pure, but I'm going to give you a little less than I agreed to. Seems a little unfair, like you agreed to 100 log of olive oil. And that's why the rabbis disagree about this. But that's, we're going to try to understand that better and what the basis of their machloket is. So now let's go back to the 5th and the 6th of the wine, and then we'll get back to the oil. The lo pligi, they actually don't disagree. The 5th, the 6th, why not? Markiatre and markiatre, each one according to their town, okay, and what went on in their area. What's the difference? Well, ba'atre demar, chafu b'kira, v'lamayitz tvei. Ba'atre demar, chafu b'kulfu, v'lamayitz tvei. It was a matter of what they lined the barrel with. In one place, they lined it with wax, and it was much less absorbed. So it was only a 6th, not a 5th. In the other place, they put pitch on it, and because it was pitch, it still did get absorbed. It got absorbed more than when the wax, which blocks it much more. Perhaps it was the land, the earth, soil in each place, and because the barrels were made with the soil, so some soil is more absorbent and some soil is less absorbent. So it just was a matter of how much the soil in this place would absorb in that one. How might tfei, how low might tfei, right? Each one absorbed more or less. Batra to Rav Yehuda. Now we're going to learn the way he's going to give some people say this was the way he would sell things and how he would make profit. Some people say it was the way he would teach the storekeepers to do it. And he wasn't a rabbi who worked and did this kind of business stuff, but he gave some advice to people about it. It doesn't really make such a difference. Just interesting, there's machloket about this among the commentaries. So in the place of Rav Yehuda, Ramu Arba'im Vitimne Kuze Bedana. Kuzim is either jugs or just a certain measurement, like a small measurement. Each barrel was filled with 48 kuzim of wine. Azil Dana Bashita Zuze. Now you would buy, if you were a merchant, you would buy it for 6 zuz, this whole barrel, which had 48 kuzim in it. Paris Rav Yehuda Shita Bezuze. So what would he do? Again, either he would do it himself. Let's just say he did it himself. He would separate. He would take this 48 kuz, and now that he bought for 6 zuz, and he would separate it six kuzim. He would sell each for a zuz. So that gets you to 36, right? 6 times 6. He would take 6 kuzim and he would sell each for a zuz. And with that, he would make back his 6 zuz that he spent. Okay, so dal, now we're going to go to amubet. Dal talta b'shita b'shita. So he was able to sell out of the 48 kuz that he bought for 6 zuz, he sold 36 for 6 zuz. Okay, again, each 6 kuz he would sell for a zuz. And times 6, that gets you to 36. Pashalu tracer, he was left with 12. Now, what do you do with those 12? Well, daltim, now you have to take off 8, shtuti, because that's the 6 that gets absorbed into the barrel. So in other words, he bought them in these little jugs, poured them into his barrel. Now his barrel absorbed already 6. Absorbed 1/6. 1/6 of 48 is 8. So out of the 12 that he had left, actually 8 just got absorbed and there's nothing to do with that. Pashalu arba, and he was left with 4 and that was his profit. Okay, now you do the math. 4 out of 48, that's a pretty low profit margin. So, ha'amar Shmuel, ha'mistaker al yistaker yoter al shtut. Because when you want to make a profit, don't make any more than a 6. But it seems like you can make a 6. So why was he making a 12? That's nothing, right? And especially if he was teaching people, this is what you should do. That's a really, it's funny, they're having this whole discussion about why he didn't make enough profit. Ika golfe ushmaria. So you still have when he bought the kuzim, he ended up with these jugs. So he got the jugs or the barrel and he got the shmarim. In other words, he did gain on the deal somewhat. Okay, I guess the people, when they bought, they brought their own jugs. So he did gain that and he got the sediment, which he didn't give to everyone. The sediment was still there. He got sediment, which not so much you could do with sediment, but there's something called temet that they would make with the sediment. So he ended up with more. To which they say, well, then if you include both those things, he's actually making more than a 6. How could he do that? So they say, well, he still had expenses. First of all, it was his time, right? He spent time separating out the wine, dealing with the wine, selling it to people. That is his time, which he's allowed to get paid for. And he had to hire someone probably to make the pkak, to open the barrel, to allow the wine to come out. So the spout, so that he had to spend money on, so he's able to deduct that. So deducting his expenses, it came out to about a 6. Okay, there we have some business advice. So now we go back to this thing about if the shemen was already, if you gave me clear without sediment, then I can't deduct the sediment. But really they're focusing on the next line, which is if you gave me old barrels, then there's no absorption. So now they say, and then you don't deduct for the absorption. What? It doesn't absorb anything? Rav Nachman. He says they're talking about where they were old and they already, right? They say here that mezupapim, they had zephyr on them or something. Someone can help me. I forgot what it is. Mezupapim. Right. They had pitch on them. Right. So because they had pitch and they absorbed, they already, because they were lined with the pitch and they had absorbed somewhat, they don't really absorb anymore. Abaye amar afilu temasha lo b'mezupapim kevan detain taun. So, well, even if they weren't mezupapim, still you could say once they absorb, they absorb. In other words, how much oil can the barrel absorb? It's very possible that once it absorbs, it's done. It can't absorb anything more, right? There's just nothing to absorb anymore. Okay, now we get to this long part, which is this machloka between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, and we have to understand it better now and what's the basis for the machloka, and we're going to have 2 opposite ways of looking at it. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it's not actually opposite ways of looking at it, but the root of their debate actually is a debate about something else, and we're going to say itself in the opposite. So Rabbi Yehuda says, also when it comes to selling, so if I sold you 100 log, I can deduct 1.5 for the sediment. So now, even though I sold you clear, right, pure oil. So Abaye says, Amar Abaye, because it's very hard to understand, because if I sold you pure olive oil for 100 log of it, why on earth would I be deducting sediment? So Amar Abaye, l'cheshatim salomer, if you think about it, Abaye says, this is the first opinion, Rav Papa's going to disagree. L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda mutar la'arev shmanim. L'divrei chachamim asur la'arev shmarim. if I tell you I'm selling you pure, am I allowed to mix in some sediment? Seems weird that we would be allowed to, but can I put sediment in there or not? So it must be that Rabbi Yehuda thinks you can, and Tanna Kama thinks you can't. Why? Well, let's explain. First, we do Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to have a big back and forth, and then we're going to get back to the rabbis. L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda mutar la'arev shmarim. V'hainu tama d'makabel. It must be that if I can add sediment, okay, I sold you, so I can add the sediment, but I don't. So now they're going to say, Da'amrle, I can say to you, in other words, you are buying it, and you have to accept it with the deduction. Why? Because I could say to you, Ibaila, Ruvelach, Milo Arvilach, I have the right, if I want, to add sediment, which means that theoretically, I can give you less. I could just skip giving you the sediment and deduct that amount and give it to you. Since I have the right to add the sediment, and I don't, but that's right, it's my right to do it, so I can give you less. So Hashanami Kabila, you have to accept it like this, with the deduction. Because you would have accepted it with the sediment, and in the end, what would you end up with? You'd have 90, 98 and a half, right? So I'll just, right, because you'd have to take off the sediment yourself. So since I theoretically could give you the sediment, I could just not give it to you and give you this oil without anything but deduct. To which they say, I don't get it. Lema lay, you could say to me, E arvit lay, havim is davinly. If you would have included the sediment, you're a seller. Also, you're buying in order to sell. So you could say, if you had given me 100 with the sediment, I could sell 100 with sediment. But now you didn't give me the sediment, so I can only go and get a price for 98 and a half. So you're making me hashda my abidle. Right? I'm not going to have it separately to go, right? Without it, I can't sell 100 log. So you're causing me a loss. To which they answer, must be bebala bayit askina. We must be talking about that I'm selling it to someone who's not doing it for resale value. And that's why I can get away with it, according to Rabbi Yehuda. I can deduct because in the end, you would have skimmed the sediment off yourself and ended up with 98 and a half. So that's why you have no choice but to accept it. Because why? It's better for you to have it pure. You don't want to have to deal with taking off the sediment. But still they say, told you we were going to get back to mechila. Why don't we say that if mutar la'arev shmanim, I could add sediment when I sell it to you, but I didn't. Isn't that an indicator that I don't care to add the sediment and I'm willing to give you 100 log without the sediment, which means I shouldn't be able to deduct because I'm the one who is mochel, basically. I'm showing that I don't care and meaning that then I have to give you the full amount because if I really wanted to get away with it, I would have included the sediment. Well, Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, delay'le mechila. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think that we can use this concept of mechila and assume that I was mochel. And that's really why. Now we're going to prove how we know Rabbi Yehuda holds this. Totally different topic. Ditnan, macharlo et tzemed, lo macharlo et bakar. Tzemed is the yoke for the animals, and the bakar are the animals themselves. If I say I'm buying a yoke, I don't mean I'm buying a yoke with the animals, right? I only get, right, if I pay you money, I get the yoke. I don't get the animals. Okay? Macharlo et bakar. If I'm buying the animals to work, right, and I want to work them together, I would need a yoke, but I didn't say I was buying a yoke. Lo macharlo et tzemed. So I can't claim what do you mean? I bought animals. I meant obviously to include the yoke. I can't go claim that. Rabbi Yehuda omer hadamim modi'in. Rabbi Yehuda says it all depends on how much I spent. What does this mean? Ketzad. Amar lo mechor litzim decha b'matayim zuz. If I say go sell me your yoke for 200 zuz. Now 200 zuz, that's the amount for 2 bites, like the amount you live off for a year. You don't buy a yoke, which is a piece of equipment that goes on the 2 animals to get them together for 200 zuz. So we look at what you spent according to Rabbi Yehuda. If I spent 200 zuz, which meant I obviously meant I'm buying the yoke and the animals. In other words, the price shows it. What does that mean? What does that have to do with mechila? Well, the price doesn't prove anything because it's likely that I was willing to overpay. Maybe you're poor and I wanted to give you extra money and I just didn't want to embarrass you and I gave it to you in the sale. And I was really, what we say, mochelet. Right? I basically gave up on my money. Like people say, keep the change, right? I didn't care. Okay? And that we assume is mechila. Now, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't think there's mechila. That's why he says it all depends on the amount. If the amount matches what I said, then yes, I only get that. But if the amount doesn't match, I obviously wasn't giving it to you to just give it to you as a gift. So I would get more items. But the main point here is that there is no such, we don't use mechila as a concept here. So we also don't use it with the sediment. When I don't give you the sediment, it's not showing I don't care and I'm happy to give you 100 log of pure virgin olive oil. No, I can actually say, I could, again, we're back to the beginning of this argument. I could have given you sediment and therefore I can deduct it. If I didn't give you the sediment, no, I can deduct it. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Back to Chachamim now. Chachamim omrim L'divrei Chachamim asur la'arev shmarim. So now we say we have to explain the rabbis. The rabbis who don't think that I can deduct that. If I said 100, I have to give you 100. So they say asur la'arev shmarim. You're not allowed to add the shmarim. V'hainu tama delo makabel. And the reason why this doesn't work, you won't accept less, is the amarle, because you could say to me, Ibai la ruve mi abasharilach. You couldn't have added the sediment, and therefore you can't deduct the sediment. That seems pretty clear. However, Rav Papa Rabbi says, what are you talking about? It's the exact opposite. Why? And now we're going to go and do the reverse of what we said about Rabbi Yehuda, which is, you can add, we're going to say that's actually the rabbis. You can add shmarim, but you didn't. So what does that show? That you were mochel, right? If you could have added shmarim and you don't, that's an indicator that you didn't care. And therefore you have to provide the full amount. So hainu tama delo makabel, the reason why you won't accept it is, if I try to give you less, damarle, you can claim to me. But the fact that you didn't add the sediment, you could have and you didn't, what does that show? Right? And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with mechila, but rabbis do. So this is the rabbi's opinion. It's all based on the opposite of what we thought the rabbis were based on. Not that I can't add the shmarim and that's why I can't deduct. Because I can add the shmarim and I didn't, it shows I didn't care and therefore I have to provide you the whole amount. L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda asur la'arev shmarim. I cannot add shmarim, so then why can I deduct? Well, hainu tamid makabel de'amarle. Ibai la'aruve lo sharile la'aruve la. Okay, now here's an interesting argument. It says the following. If I'm not allowed to add shmarim, so now I can't. So kibule lo makabelt, what? Are you not going to accept this if I deduct it? Because zvon v'zabin tagra ikre. If I'd be mocked in the street if I didn't deduct. Because what? I bought this myself. I spent money on this in order to resell to you. Now, if I have to take out some and sell you less, I'm basically going to make, right? I'm making no profit whatsoever. People are going to say to me, you buy and you sell and you call yourself a business person? You're an idiot. You don't know how to make any profit. In other words, the point is I have to make some profit. And if I sell you this, then you're not going to allow me to make any sort of profit whatsoever. So I'm going to have to deduct somewhat because I had to buy it with the sediment. So of course, when I sell it back to you, and I said 100 log, but I'm not really going to give you 100 log because I had to take out the sediment. I'm not going to take that as a loss for myself. So that wouldn't be proper, a good business model. It's interesting that you have to accept that because I have to make a profit. You have to agree that I have to make a profit, which is interesting. Okay, last point for today. We'll stop before the Mishna. Along daf Tana. This is a statement. We don't really understand what this means. Both a buyer and a person who gives you something to watch, okay? Lipkatim. Now, the pkatim are some sort of, in addition to the sediment, there's also like either the pits of the olives or the foam that's at the top. There's like something additional besides the sediment. So now they're the same when it comes to pkatim. So what exactly is this? There's a range of opinions about what exactly this is. Some people say it's the part at the top, the scum. Some people say it's a part that's on top of the sediment at the bottom, whatever it is. The law is the same. So my lipkatim, what are we talking about? And how is the lokach like the mafkid? Okay, when you buy oil, you definitely don't get that. Okay, we already said maybe they could deduct and give you the sediment, but nobody says they give you the pkatim. Nobody wants that. So maybe it means that if you give me something to watch, when I give it back, if you gave it to me with pkatim, I have to remove the pkatim and I have to replace that with oil. That's ridiculous. Why would I have to do that? I could say to you, what are you talking about? I don't have to replace your pkatim. What? I was watching your stuff. I don't have to replace it with mine. You gave me with pkatim. You obviously get it back. So that can't possibly be. Maybe it means when, or again, this is going to be ridiculous, but if you say that it means just like the mafkid could have katim in it, has to, in other words, if you gave me with katim, I give it back to you with the scum on the top. So likewise, when you buy it, you have to take it with the scum. But of course not. Nobody thinks that. It says in a braita, you don't care. Okay, here, Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying the whole thing about the muddled oil is that you get it with the sediment possibly, and you can deduct the sediment. But nobody says you get it with the pkatim. Nobody was talking about the pkatim at all, for sure not. So lo kasha. They're now going to say, here's how we explain this statement. Hadiyav lezuze b'tishrei v'kashakal minei b'nisan ki mida de tishrei. And hadiyav lezuze b'nisan v'kashakal minei b'nisan ki mida b'nisan. It all depends on when I bought it and for what price. If I bought it in Tishrei, which is the beginning of the season, when everything, all the sediment and all the scum is still there, and you can buy the oil for a much lower price, but I only took it in Nisan when it already was ready, then you can give it to me with the scum, or you can deduct that amount because I paid the lower price and a price when that stuff was still mixed in there at a time when it was still mixed in. But if I gave you money in Nisan when it was already, the scum was already, no one's going to buy it in Nisan at the higher price when the oil is already with the scum on it, and I paid you the higher price, then you can't include the scum or deduct it in any way. Okay, learned a lot about oil, a bit about wine, a bit about all these other grains and mice eating them. The main topic for today, after we finish with the Mari bar Isak story and how it connected with our previous topic of the watching someone's property, we then went into what kind of deductions can you basically make when you're watching someone's stuff. If you remember, we talked about it's only if I mixed it up and I already don't know. If I stuck it in a corner, obviously that's a whole different story. You would get it back as is. And then, the whole thing when Rabbi Yehuda compared it to when you sell, even in a sale you can deduct, and there was this big machlok between him and the rabbis, can you deduct or can you not, the amount of the sediment. And that all depends on whether you hold you can add the sediment or you can't add the sediment, and we proved it in different directions. How, right, you could say that means we hold like this one, that one was like this one, or actually possibly the reverse. We gave two different interpretations just to make things confusing. And then we talked about these katim and the scum at the top, or possibly something else. And that really is not usually involved unless you were to sell it in those early months when it's still there and it's the cheaper price. And then you actually might have locked into, yes, accept that as part of your deal. With that, we'll finish for today, and we'll pick up from the new Mishna in tomorrow's Shiur. Have a great day, everyone. Hoping for good news in the coming days.